Give me a bird's eye view of the current state of the Indian bar and restaurant scene. What does it look like in 2024?
Thanks, Tristan. And we've been in this industry now for about 24 years. Next year marks a quarter of a century for my company. And it'd be fair to say that the Indian bar scene has come a long, long way in the last 25 years. But I'd say particularly in the last 5 to 7 years, there's been a lot that's happened that's contributed to this. And I think some of the key factors are we've had some of India's top bartenders open up bars to help shape bar culture in the country. We've had a change in the way entrepreneurs have seen the bar industry. So previously it was more from a business mindset, but now we have entrepreneurs in the system who are setting up chains across the country and not looking at it purely from the point of view of a dollars and cents point of view, but more about how they can help also build bar culture. So they may not be bartenders themselves, but they're looking at it very much from a bar perspective and supporting their bar teams as a part of this entire endeavor. I think thirdly, what's been great is the support the beverage industry has given bars and bartenders in particular. The exposure Indian bartenders have got through training programs, bartending competitions, giving them overseas exposure. And nowadays with Instagram in particular, it's very easy to form these global networks and learn from what's happening in the rest of the world and form connections also with some of their contemporaries across the world. Yeah. And I think lastly, in particular, I'd say is the way Indian bartenders have flourished. And we're now seeing Indian bartenders across the rest of the world now. And some of the top bars in the world have Indian bartenders at the helm. A lot of great Indian bartending talent has flourished, and they've flourished despite a lot of constraints from an Indian ingredient perspective. We don't get a lot of spirits and liqueurs in India like they do in the rest of the world. So we've had to improvise. In Hindi, in India, we have a word called jugaad. And jugaad kind of means make do or can do. So that make do or can do spirit is something which keeps us fired every day, I guess. So, yeah.
And where are the key locations, cities, regions where you would say that the bar culture is really firing on all cylinders and taking off?
Well, it's greatly democratized in the last few years. The main epicenters are still Delhi and Gurgaon, what we call the National Capital Region, Mumbai, Bangalore, and Goa. But now we're seeing Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities like Pune, Jaipur, Kolkata, Guwahati, Chennai, also flourishing when it comes to bars and cocktail culture. So the consumer in these cities is also fast evolving and looking for something that they can drink in their city. The Indian consumer is a fairly well-traveled consumer. They're looking for a similar experience which they get in any global city around the world. So I think Indian entrepreneurs are again responding to this by setting up bars in their own cities to cater to this, to scratch this itch, shall I say.
And are there bar operators who are operating across multiple cities with chains of cocktail bars?
Absolutely. I mentioned that in my previous point. So we have at least 3 to 4 such operators who run maybe 20 to 30 to 50 different outlets across the country and are constantly pushing the envelope in terms of opening up new formats, new bars, and new cities.
And is there any rule or reason to the styles of bars that are opening, or does it cross kind of all types of cocktail bar?
I think pretty much all kinds of cocktail bars. We have a few speakeasy bars across the country. I'd say genuine speakeasies, 3 to 5 of them. A fair amount of cocktail lounges. We have a few now spirit specialized bars. We've always had a few gin focused bars. Recently, we had a couple of rum focused bars which have opened. So rum and rum cocktails is an exposure point of view. Other than that, I'd say not that much else possibly in terms of formats, etc. So cocktail lounges, 5-star hotels are focusing a lot now on their bar environment and bar scene. So that's a good trend.
You mentioned that things have changed a lot in the last 5 to 7 years. There was a pandemic kind of in the middle of that. How did that affect hospitality in India?
Well, in a similar fashion as it did, I'm sure, in the rest of the world. So it was tough going for a lot of bars and restaurants. It didn't shake out the industry as much as possibly it might have had. So not that many bars were impacted or had to close down as a result of it. One silver lining in a sense was if new locations opened up. Like Goa, for example, never really had that thriving bar scene. But during Goa, a lot of the country flocked to Goa. They saw it as a kind of refuge from the pandemic. And that led to a very thriving bar and restaurant scene coming up in Goa in particular. I'd say by and large, owners were fairly supportive of their staff and ensure that they could keep their home fires burning through those times.
Yeah. I mean, in some parts of the world, I feel like the pandemic was a bit of a reset, and it kind of cut out the dead wood. Bars that weren't sustainable financially or for any other reason ended up closing. And by the way, I should say that, I was victim to one or two of those myself. Do you feel like that possibly played out in India as well, especially since you're sort of describing the last few years as been, a real incredible time for new openings by perhaps cutting out some of those other bars and then letting new stuff open? It's like cutting the dead wood off and new sapling comes up,
Yeah. I'd say nothing noticeable as such which was impacted. So a lot of the bars which might have been in existence for no particular reason, apart from the fact that they were, just, I won't go down that street, but they weren't really noticed if they did close down.
Yeah, I get the type of bar you're talking about. Yeah.
But I think what kind of also, from a healthy trend perspective, premiumization got a big upswing. The consumer was more focused now, I think, on drinking better. And maybe drinking less rather than drinking more, and looking more towards drinking something which was a little maybe more expensive perhaps. That was good.
Is there that sentiment of, moderating alcohol consumption, maybe looking at non-alc or low-alc alternatives? Is that going on in India?
Well, we don't really have a no-low trend at the moment in India. So that doesn't exist. But I'd say on the flip side, we also don't really have a very strong element of binge drinking,
right,
shall I say. So yeah, I've been in Dublin on St. Patrick's Day in the Temple Bar area, so I know what that looks like.
You've witnessed it firsthand. Yeah. I mean, in the British Isles, we've really perfected that art, And you've got 30 Best Bars Awards, which you founded. When did that start?
2019.
2019, right. And tell me a little bit about how that works, how it's structured, the judging panel, and so on.
Right. When we began this, me and my partner from Man's World magazine, there was no Indian bar in the world's top 50 or world's top 100, or even the Asia's top 50 or top 100. And we felt that Indian bars were really kind of, as I mentioned, getting out there and building better bar environments and better bar cultures, and an overall more progressive bar program. So we felt it was a shame, not just from the perspective of greater discoverability in the country for consumers to know great bars to go out to, but also definitely at a nation and global level. So that was a kind of the route behind setting it up. And we've completed 4 editions now. We're in the 5th edition. The finale is on January 13th, 2025 in Goa. Looking forward to that. And I think a byproduct of what we kind of created is that now, because due to the nature of the judging process that we go through, which is fairly elaborate and fairly well documented, shall I say, plus the kind of credibility that we enjoy in the industry, fingers crossed, that bar owners realize the only way to get onto that list is through the work that they put in. So which has been absolutely great. So now that list of the top 30 bars has become extremely aspirational for bars and bar owners and bartenders. So they're investing in their bars like never before. In their ice program, their glassware, the cocktail menu design, the bar talent. And I think that's a win-win for everybody as a part of the ecosystem. Yeah. So very happy about that.
That's amazing. And I think there's a lot of cynicism about awards and lists and so on. And it's, I find myself personally jumping from both sides of the fence. On the one hand, I think bars and bartenders can become a little bit obsessed with these awards and end up kind of gearing their entire MO towards getting it on this list or achieving this award or getting nominated for an award.
Yeah.
Sometimes to the detriment of the general service in the place. You visit some bars now, there's a few guilty suspects where you feel like it's an exercise in award winning rather than an exercise in hospitality. That's the negative side of it. But the positive side, which you've just eloquently put, is that by giving operators and bartenders something to strive towards, it just raises everyone up. It demands that you up your game, you set your standards, you strive towards perhaps a list of standards that are expected of you in order to get nominated for one of these awards, and you make the service count when people come in, because you don't necessarily know if they're a judge or whatever. And there is that sort of work characteristic in which it whips everyone up in the same kind of culture of achievement and attainment within hospitality. So yeah, it's I love them and I hate them,
No, absolutely. And I think the Indian bar industry is still in a fairly nascent stage. So something like this is
Really
definitely,
important.
hopefully, gives them a fillip. After we launched in 2023, there were 8 Indian bars in Asia's top 100. So I think, obviously, the credit primarily goes to the bar operators and owners. But I'd say hopefully what we've done is also help increase the spotlight on the Indian bar scene.
So, excuse me for not knowing, but are there any bars now, Indian bars, in the world's top 50 or world's top 100?
Well, the 51 to 100 list launched last week, and there's no Indian bar in 51 to 100.
In 51 to 100.
Yeah, but 22nd May in Madrid, we'll get to know if there's any Indian bar in the top 50.
And how are you feeling? Are you confident? Have you heard any inside scoop or?
I have no inside scoop, but I think for a geography as big as India, it'll be shame if there's not at least one bar in the top 50.
And that would be the first time, would it, or not?
No, Sidecar has been in the
Sidecar. Right.
Yeah.
So Sidecar, where does Sidecar place?
Sidecar is not in 51 to 100 this year.
So you're thinking it's going to be a top 50?
I
Hopefully.
don't know, because they didn't feature in Asia's top 50 this year, which was a bit of a surprise.
Right.
So I'm sure that there's some amount of consonance between the lists. So let's see what happens.
Describe Sidecar to me. I've not been there. So what is it like as a bar?
Well, Sidecar is a bar owned by 2 friends of mine, Lama and Meenakshi. And Meenakshi is a veteran of the Indian spirits industry. She's worked at Diageo and Pernod. And Youngdup is one of India's most well-reputed bartenders and now bar owners with about 30 years of experience. So they began their first bar called Cocktails and Dreams Speakeasy about 12 years ago. And that was more of a neighborhood bar in Gurgaon. So it was kind of a leap of faith given the location. But it did well enough for them to realize that there was an opportunity to open up multiple bars after that. And therefore they opened up Sidecar, which was in Delhi. And the Delhi audience is less price sensitive, shall I say, to the Gurgaon audience. So more free spenders. It's a different demographic. So the pricing there can be far more aggressive, shall I say. So Sidecar is a very classic bar. In India, Tristan, we haven't really had that many bars which have been bars in themselves in terms of pure bars. They've mostly been restaurants which also have a bar attached to them. And there have been just a few bars in the last few years which have come into being, which can be classified as focused just on the bar and the bartenders. And Sidecar was one of those bars. Given both Lama's profile and Meenakshi's profile in particular, it helped really propel them to another level of recognition and acclaim, and got a lot of top talent who want to come and work with them. So it's a nice multi-story bar. The first level is more casual with a coffee scene. The second level is where the bar really comes into play. It's a nice long bar which occupies most of one side of the room, a small stage for some live music, and some great seating if you're lucky enough to find a seat.
If you're lucky enough, yeah. Reservations advised. Are there any other bars that you'd want to call out across the country that you really feel are doing something special?
Well, a lot now, I think. There are a lot across the country. One of my own favorites is a small bar in Delhi called Hoots. It's like a small speakeasy style bar. One of my perennial favorites. I love the ambience and the vibe. Bangalore has a few bars which are really opened up in the last 1 year. There's one called Soka, the other called Spirit Forward, which again are very small, tight places, again completely focused on the bar. They've been largely responsible for changing around the cocktail culture in Bangalore and getting consumers into cocktails in a big way. So I love it when bars like this come around in a city and help change the consumer's perception and view of cocktails. And that's happening across the country in multiple cities. So it's great.
Is there a kind of general Indian taste and perhaps it's regional for cocktails? Indian people tend to prefer sweeter drinks, more bitter drinks, sour drinks. Would you be able to kind of pigeonhole it in that way, or is it just too broad?
I think it largely mirrors what we like from a food perspective. So we like drinks which are more flavor forward.
Yeah.
So flavor is extremely important. In depending on the city you're in, some of the cities still have a more sweeter palate, but most of the larger cocktail cities are moving towards a more balanced palate, but definitely more flavor forward, and also could be potentially say spicy drinks. So a drink like the Picante, for example, works very well in India. It has a nice piquant, spicy touch to it, which works great.
I always Ricky's still quite popular. I always thought Ricky
Ricks.
was
Ricks.
with lime and
So Ricky's, gin Ricky's. No.
No. Okay.
Haven't heard that.
Okay. Oh, I've got bad intel on that there. I remember drinking Ricky's in Delhi once, and someone there said, "Oh yeah, these are popular because you know with a Ricky you sometimes put salt in it." And so salt helps with hydration. Obviously, it's pretty hot, but I was clearly being fed total nonsense by whoever was saying it to me. So I want to talk to you a little bit about spirits in India. I mean, I'm not sure where to start. I definitely want to get onto the subject of indigenous Indian spirits, which I'm fascinated to hear about. But perhaps before we go there, we should talk a bit about the more famous spirits that are being made there, such as whiskey and rum and so on.
Right.
So can you give me a kind of snapshot of what the whiskey industry looks like in India and how that's changed over the last few decades?
Yeah, absolutely. And India is about a 385 million case spirits market. 2023 IWSR data. So that's a
lot.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. Yeah, just for context, everyone, that's a lot.
And that's a 12 bottle 750 ml 750 ml
9 liter, yeah.
case we're talking about, 9 liters. And out of that, a really large percentage is, so whiskey is about 65 to 70% of that. So about 250 million cases and upwards. India is the largest whiskey market in the world. We're also the number one export market for Scotch whiskey in the world. A lot of that is bulk whiskey, which goes in some of the cheaper Indian blends, but it's also whiskey which is being bottled in India or coming over as imports. And I think what we're seeing over the last few years, not just in whiskey but in other categories also, that there's been premiumizing. So consumers are going up the ladder much faster. Earlier, a lot of the cheaper Indian whiskeys had a fair amount of molasses in the blend as compared to grain. So they weren't really whiskeys as per the EU classification. But now even the cheaper end of whiskeys are moving to full grain-based ENA.
Really?
Because they're realizing the consumer is now asking what's in the whiskey. Does it have molasses? Does it have grain? And they're being forced also to move up. Plus, of course, the consumer is willing to pay a little bit more for, say, grain-based ENA whiskeys.
India may end up being the biggest whiskey producer in the world, if not already, which is quite incredible. So with that shift from partially molasses through to 100% grain, is there a noticeable change in the quality of the cheaper whiskies as well? Can you really experience that in the taste?
Yes, I think absolutely. And the consumer is also becoming more discerning from a liquid perspective, and also from a branding and packaging perspective. So everybody's having to work on their blends, and it's a fairly competitive market. Lots of companies in the fray. So brands are having to continuously kind of reevaluate their blend and see how it's working in the marketplace.
Yeah. And then, of course, at the premium end, super premium end, you've got some really great brands that we are seeing filter through to the UK.
Yeah.
Paul John, Ramper, there's some others as well.
Amrut.
Yeah, Amrut, of course. Yeah, and these are great whiskies. Like, I was recently drinking Ramper Asava.
Right.
And because that's aged in Indian red wine casks, and it's delicious. And I always find it fascinating how whiskey, I think perhaps is possibly the greatest example of this. As you move around the world and taste whiskies from different countries, of course they're still making it from the same ingredients. It's still grain, it's still wooden barrels, and yeast and water and so on. And yet you find that so much of the flavor of the culture ends up in the bottle. And you mentioned about cocktails and intensity of flavor and richness and character. That's what you get with Rampa Asava. It is full on. It's like a chutney. It's got all that sort of dark, little bit of spice, sort of red fruits, and it really hums on the palate. And it's just so obviously Indian in its origin, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's bang on, Tristan, from a flavor perspective. What probably differentiates Indian single malt from, say, single malt from Scotland is in part the grain that they use. So we use the 6-row barley as compared to the 2-row in Scotland, and I believe the protein content is more there in the 6-row as compared to the 2-row, giving it a greater flavor profile. And the other aspect really is the temperatures in India.
Sure.
So the extremity of the temperatures in India ensure, I guess, a far greater contact, etc., with the barrel, and that definitely plays out when it comes to the liquid profile, which you tasted in the Rampur Asava.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I was chatting with Jason of IWSR the other day. He looks after the India beat, and he talked about how you're familiar with the term IMFL?
IMFL? No.
So IMFL means Indian made foreign liquor.
Ah, yes. Okay.
So it's like part of the British legacy to us in that these are foreign liquors which are made in India, like gin, rum, vodka, whiskey. And Jason talked about how now companies and brands in India are now focusing more on the I in the IMFL. So rather than just aping a conventional, say, London Dry gin or a whiskey or a rum, they're now looking at how they can innovate when it comes to the product itself from a botanicals perspective. We're seeing some very interesting use of Ayurvedic ingredients in the seasoning of the casks for the finishing of single malt whiskey. So brands are constantly trying to innovate, definitely.
Yeah. You mentioned botanicals. From a British perspective, there always feels like there's a connection there with gin and tonic and so on. You know, we have Indian written on our tonic water and what have you. How is the gin market in India? Because again, it feels, besides the sort of being the birthplace of the gin and tonic, it feels like with all of the range of spices and herbs available to you that are growing there, that it's just prime for making some fantastic spirits.
Yeah. Well, the gin market really has been on fire for the last 4 to 5 years. It's ebbed a little bit now, and I'll come to that in a minute. But apart from single malt whiskey, gin really is what kind of launched 1,000 Indian spirits, because that's what really caught the imagination of entrepreneurs. And the early entrepreneurs tasted a fair amount of success in getting their gin brands off the ground. And it gave a lot of courage to more entrepreneurs to come in and start their own spirits brands. And I've really seen this happen in the last 5 years, because apart from that, you didn't really have any entrepreneurship when it came to the Indian spirits industry. So I think the biggest single contribution, apart from the fact that we now have some great gins in the country, is the fact that we've now got 1 million entrepreneurs who bloomed and starting up their own interesting brands. So that's been great.
Nice.
Yeah.
What about rum? Because you grow sugarcane in India, right? And I realized that there's imported rums, but there's also Indian rums that are very popular, right?
So rum kind of followed the gin wave of premiumization. So in India, typically we've always had the old British Navy style rums, dark rums like Old Monk that we're familiar with.
Yeah.
But a new breed of entrepreneurs have begun a range of rums, say gold rums, spiced rums, white rums, aged rums. One of my friends began a rum brand called Makazai, for example. It's interesting how they're playing with the liquid and the spirit. We've very recently had 3 jaggery-based rums launch, in fact.
Okay.
So jaggery is a derivative of sugar.
Yeah.
It's also sweet. So brands are seeing again how they can bring that I back into the IMFL.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And is there anyone making sugarcane juice rums, like agricole style rum?
We have one agricole style rum. It's called Kamikara, which means liquid gold in Sanskrit. And we have a second agricole style rum about to launch, I'd say, sometime this year. Yeah.
And moving on quickly, what about agave spirits?
Well, India grows the agave Americana and fairly abundantly in our Deccan Plateau. Similar kind of arid conditions as we see in Mexico. So a smart entrepreneur, a guy I call the Willy Wonka of Indian alcohol, he spotted that and he began to then make agave spirit about 12 to 13 years ago. Agave has suddenly gone through a boom in India in the last couple of years. And Indian
imported agave spirits have,
overall, so tequila has gone through a boom in India, and Indian agave spirits have kind of caught the tailwind of that. So The entrepreneur in particular is doubling his capacity of agave production. He also sells agave spirit to another entrepreneur who also sells it under his own brand called Pistola. So the original one is Jessamine G.
Yes, I've heard.
And Pistola is another one which Diageo has just taken a stake in. So tequila is really trending very, very heavily at the moment in India. Yeah.
So is he the only producer at the moment, or are there other producers?
He's the only producer of agave spirit in India.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So it's pretty minimal then in terms of the brands at the moment and the number of producers. Do you think can you see it, more producers starting to grow agaves and do it, or is this just this one mad guy who?
Desmond won't like me for calling him mad.
My words. Sorry, you said Willy Wonka. I said mad. Yeah. What is his name?
Desmond Nazareth.
Okay.
Desmond Nazareth. Yeah.
Sorry, Desmond.
No, he's a nice guy. So I don't know whether any of the producers will come on stream in the years to come. Des is doubling his capacity, and he might not be able to sell all of it under his own brand. So I think other entrepreneurs like Pistola founder Rakshay will come along and pick up some spirit from him and brand it and age it and brand it under their own brand name.
And it's 100% agave Americana, is it? Or are there other species or varieties that he's growing? With just
only the Americana, which grows from what I know. I don't know if anything else grows, so I don't know about that though.
Fascinating, fascinating. I just got back, not about 6 months ago, did a big tour of Mexico.
Lovely.
Did like 40 different distilleries and palenques, and so I was fully immersed in agave spirits. But
Nice.
it's really interesting because we've got South Africa, Australia also producing agave spirits, India. America.
I was at a competition called Spirit Selection in China about a month or so ago, and they have an agave spirit from there called Kokoi.
Chinese one.
No, it's from Venezuela.
Oh, from Venezuela.
From Venezuela. So that turned up on our judging panel, and we had no idea what it was. So our jury chair did some quick researching to find that it was from an agave grown in Venezuela.
Wow.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Indigenous Indian spirits. This is really fascinating to me. What came before agave, whiskey, rum, all of these products that have their birthplace elsewhere in the world. Can we start by talking about the history of distillation in India? When did it first arrive?
I don't really know if there's anything which kind of traces back the history of distillation in India. India has these very traditional religious texts called the Vedas, and there is mention in these texts of a liquid called somras, which literally translates into nectar of the gods. But there's no reference to whether that was distilled or what kind of alcohol that was. But one native spirit in particular called Mahua definitely finds reference to that about 2,000 years ago in our texts. But I'm not sure, or there's no precise mention as to whether that was just consumed after being natural fermented, or whether that went through a distillation process as such. But definitely, we have another native spirit called Feni from Goa, the western state of Goa. And there is a mention about 1750 or thereof about the Portuguese first taxing Feni, which was then a distilled spirit and being kind of distilled in people's backyards. So potentially maybe 275 to 300 years ago is when we might at least have some tangible trace back to something which was distilled, albeit at a very, very kind of crude form or shape. Yeah.
And what is considered to be the oldest spirit produced in India? Would that be Feni or something else?
Mahua.
Mahua.
That would be Mahua.
And what is that made from?
Mahua is the world's only spirit made from a flower. So it's
It doesn't sound like there's a lot of fermentable sugar in there.
It's packed with sugar.
Right.
It's packed with sugar even after being dried.
Right. You need a lot of flowers. How big are the flowers?
The flowers are very small, so they're
This isn't sounding good so far.
but they're packed with this pulpy sugar inside, which retains the starch even after being dried.
Right.
So it's quite incredible, and you can make the spirit just out of 100% Mahua at 42% alcohol. So.
Right. And what is the process of making Mahua look like?
So the word Mahua literally comes from the Mahua tree. And the Mahua tree grows widely across central India in about 13 states of India. India's about 28 states. And it's also known as the tree of life for our tribal communities. So about 100 million people across the central belt of India rely very strongly on the Mahua tree, both for a source of protein and nutrition, as well as for making cooking oil from the fruit. So it's very much an integral part of their life. And we're talking about 100 million people here. Yeah. The Mahua tree flowers once in a year, typically in late March, early April, and it has these white flowers which fall to the ground. It can only be collected after it's fallen to the ground. It can't be plucked off the tree as per the law, and that's also when it's the ripest. So it's packed with that sugar.
So you have to collect them off the ground.
Off the ground, yeah. So what they do is interesting. They burn the forest floors beforehand, so the white of the flower can show up when they're collecting the flowers early in the morning.
Really?
Yeah.
That's clever.
Yeah.
Okay. So you set. I mean, but it's all sounding very labor intensive so far for collecting.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So it's all basically primarily the women and the children who go out and collect the flowers. They dry the flowers typically on the side of the road. Once the flowers are dried, they collect them in these large gunny bags, gunny sacks. They're sold to traders, and then off they go. Or they make Mahua in their backyard still. So just typically just ferment it and give it a basic single distillation. And they've got a spirit which they can drink. Since it's so full of sugar, it's also used for gruels and syrups and vinegar. So it's a great source of nutrition also for the tribals when in tough times in particular. It's a natural source of nutrition.
And just eaten like as it is as well?
It's dried. An entrepreneur who's a friend of mine, they've begun an edible Mahua to be eaten. It tastes very much like a resinous fig.
Right.
And it's packed with nutrition and protein. So it's quite handy that way.
Pretty good. Yeah. I bet the kids love picking it up because they just snack on it while they're going.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So it's collected, sold to traders, and then depending on what happens, it's fermented and then distilled. So yeah.
So you add water, and then do they let it ferment naturally, or just let the yeast?
They add yeast.
They add yeast.
Yeah. Yeast. So they add water to rehydrate it, and then they add some yeast.
Yeah.
And then they distill it, double distillation.
And this is in like alembic copper pot stills, that sort of thing, or is there specific types of still materials that are used in these communities?
No. So in the backyard stills, it's still fairly rudimentary. So we're not talking about copper there, or what do they have in their backyard. But there are a couple of commercial producers of Mahua now in India, one including Desmond, who makes the agave.
Okay.
So he uses his same copper pot stills as he does for the agave to make Mahua also. And the other is a producer in Maharashtra who also make Indian single malt. So when they use copper pot stills, I don't think they're alembic stills, but regular copper pot stills yeah.
Nice. And what can you say about the sort of tradition of this spirit? Is it used in ceremonies? Is it something that's consumed at specific occasions, like marriages, deaths, that kind of thing?
No, there's nothing, shall I say, ceremonial about it. Of course, definitely. Considering it has tribal roots, and the tribals are very much worshippers of sun, moon, and nature, right? And nature is primarily the forests and the trees. So they definitely worship the Mahua tree in a form and a sense. There's a style of painting in India called the Gond painting, Gond, and it's fairly well known from a visual perspective, very colorful. So lots of Gond paintings have these trees symbolized and pictured in them. It's a beautiful art form. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
And I mean, is the industry, if that's even the right term, for producing Mahua sophisticated enough that you might be able to sort of define regional styles or anything like that? Or are there any other styles such as barrel aged, for example?
Well, I've spoken to people about this. So there is no real influence of terroir, shall I say, on the spirit at the end of the day. There are two main species of the Mahua tree, the Maduka longifolia and the Maduka latifolia, depending on which part of the country they grow in. But typically when their flowers are plucked, the flowers are typically mixed together. So you can't really distinguish as being one from or the other.
Sure.
So I wouldn't say there's anything particular which comes from where the tree is grown. It's again too nascent when it comes to that.
Yeah.
And we just have at the moment, I'd say 2 or 3 commercial producers of Mahua. So it's again fairly recent from a commercialization perspective. A brand has just launched last month, and I've got that with me for tasting tomorrow, called Six Brothers. It's quite an interesting brand because native spirits in India like Feni and Mahua can be very much of an acquired taste from the aroma and the taste perspective, right? So very difficult for them to appeal to a larger audience. So some brands are trying to kind of balance that out so they can appeal to that wider audience and get more different consumption forms for that spirit as compared to it just being perceived more as something which the locals drink, shall I say.
Got you. Yeah. Sometimes it's a PR exercise as much as anything, you know? And I think Mexican spirits has suffered from that in the past, where mezcal was considered to be, and raicilla considered to be, a lower class drink.
Right.
And now all of a sudden everyone's realizing, oh wait, this might be more interesting than tequila, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So how would you describe the flavor of Mahua?
Well, it's quite interesting. It's very floral, shall I say?
That's not surprising.
Yeah, given that it's from the flower. It's not as acidic as an agave, but has a very distinctive taste profile. I've drunk it as a sipping spirit also, and it worked very well for me just on its own.
So if you're not drinking it on its own, what are you doing? Are you mixing it with like soda or?
Yeah, you can mix it with soda or tonic, half soda, half tonic. They have an interesting drinking ritual with Mahua, wherein you're familiar with the guava fruit. So you take some guava and some red chili, and you have a bite of that guava with red chili and have a sip of the Mahua. It goes very well. So like I say, we love our spice in India.
Sounds like a tequila and sangrita kind of thing, you know, where you go back and forth back too. I like that. Yeah, that sounds great. So let's go back to Feni. We touched on briefly. What is that made from?
Well, Feni is made from two major sources. One is the cashew fruit, and the second is coconut sap. And the cashew Feni in particular owes its origins to the Portuguese, because the Portuguese had a colony in India called Goa, right? The British had the rest of India. And the Portuguese brought the cashew tree over from Brazil, which is also a Portuguese colony, primarily to check erosion in Goa. And that tree took very well to the Goan climate. It led to the cashew coming into being in India. And we kind of can trace back to the 17th century. There's mention of something called nasha pani. Nasha literally means intoxicating water. So intoxicating water typically from the cashew tree. The nut is what you're familiar with in terms of the cashew nut, which is the seed. But what we're talking about essentially is the fruit. So in Mahua's case, it's the flower. In the cashew's case, it's that pulpous fruit which contributes the sugar which comes into the cashew Feni.
Yeah. They're funny fruits, aren't they, when you see them grow? Because it's like the fruit and then the nut's kind of hanging out at the bottom, isn't it?
Absolutely. So it again can't be plucked off the tree. It can only be collected once it's fallen on the ground. And it has to be full of that sugar.
Yeah. I mean, I guess at least then you know it's ripe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Yeah. It's just, I guess, the risk of rot or insects or whatever.
No, it's collected very fast.
Yeah.
So during the cashew harvest season, there are these the workers called cascars. They go up the slopes with they've got these rods and hooks. So they keep hooking and putting them into the basket and collecting them. So there's no real danger of that, although considering it's so sugar rich, a lot of people would a lot of the insects, etc., would love to.
Yeah.
We had a company offsite, in fact, a couple of years ago. So we went through a fazenda, which is a farms which has a cashew plantation. So we went up the slope, collected the cashew, brought it back up, twisted the cashew to release the nut, and then we did a part of the following process also. Yeah, too.
So you remove the nuts out, they get sent off for being nuts.
Yeah.
And then the fruit is then just mashed up and let ferment? So
the fruit, conventionally, basically, you've got these big boots, gum boots, and you collect them all into like a small concrete enclosure, and then you kind of keep jumping on them, like I do with grapes.
Yeah.
Say grape stamping to release the juice from that. That then gets fermented and then distilled. So it depends, in a sense of that process depends upon where it's being kind of fermented and distilled. In Goa, there again would be maybe hundreds and hundreds of stills across the state of Goa, which are kind of making their own Feni and bottling it and selling it in the local taverna or shop. So the government gives two separate licenses. One is an auction right for a bunch of cashew trees, and one is the rights to distill that particular spirit coming from the cashews coming from that. So those are two separate
So the trees
licenses
are owned by the government, and then they're basically leased to to farmers, and then they may indeed then sell them to a distiller. So there's sort of three steps there.
That's right. Or in some cases, they might have both. They might have the right to collect the cashew as well as to distill it. They might have got both those particular licenses. Yeah.
So you're saying more than 100 distilleries producing this around Goa?
Maybe 1,000, I'd say, at least.
1,000?
Yeah. So these are like backyard stills.
So this is what's incredible. It's like, for years we've kind of people have talked about, Speyside is the highest concentration of distilleries in the world,
Yeah.
And then we find out that, in Oaxaca, there's 2,000 distilleries. We find out that in Haiti, there's hundreds and hundreds of rum distilleries, or Clarin. And now you're telling me that in one state of India, we've got maybe 1,000 producers of Feni, which is a spirit that most people have never heard of.
Yeah. Which, like you mentioned some time back, talk about mezcal, when the British left India and we had the IMFL, for example, right, which was whiskey, gin, rum, vodka, but nobody knew how to classify these spirits like Feni and Mahua. So they got clubbed under a category called country liquor.
Yeah, which sounds derogatory, right?
Absolutely. So that was like the seal of death for them.
Yeah.
So for a spirit to be classified as country liquor meant it couldn't really be exported outside their state. On the flip side, it did get a very low rate of taxation, so made it far cheaper for people to buy. But from an imagery perspective, it kind of got tagged with that country liquor. So which is what is the challenge now for entrepreneurs trying to break out from that, because now you have some extremely premium country liquors, fairly expensive ones. So they, in a sense, need to define the category and create the category from scratch.
And the premium ones, are these new producers that are starting up, or is it old ones that are kind of sorting out their packaging or have been kind of identified as producing in the most authentic, most delicious, most flavorsome way, or is it a bit of both?
Well, in the case of Feni, one entrepreneur in particular, a guy called Hansel Vaz. So about 12 years ago, he began a brand called Kazulo, which means firefly in Konkani. And he had a family distillery which was kind of going to seed. So he took it upon himself to kind of resurrect Feni as a category, because primarily you either had the local Fenis, which worked absolutely fine, but primarily consumed in tavernas by the local population, or you had these mass Fenis, which were more like tourist trap Fenis. You one day Goa, you picked up a bottle of Feni in a cane wrapping, and then it lay in your bar for years to come, but you hated the taste of it. And the smell also is extremely off-putting. So Hansel tried to refine that. So he saw that there was the case for it, and he refined it both from a process perspective as well as working on the liquid to make the aroma more sensorial, and the palate something which people could drink without gagging on it.
Always good.
Yeah,
they can do that.
And he worked a lot on the branding and packaging side, so that it all came together as a great proposition. He sold it in the market at about 3 times the cost of regular Fenis. People thought he was mad. But now you've got more producers which have kind of followed in that vein and looking at how they can kind of upscale Feni.
How would that price, that 3 times the price, how would that compare to, say, a bottle of Johnny Walker Black Label?
Well, it's still very cheap, because when he launched his Kazulo Feni, it would have been, say, 8 quid in Goa, say 7 to 8 quid, as compared to Johnny Walker would have been about 30 quid. So still very cheap, but the locals are used to buying Feni at 2 quid or 1 quid.
Very, very cheap.
Because they're making in their backyard, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And does Feni have any kind of cultural significance in terms of when it is consumed or where it is consumed? Is it?
It's consumed through the year. There's Cashew Feni in particular has a season. Coconut Feni, which is made from the sap collected from the coconut tree, is kind of produced and consumed again through the year. So there's no real timing, as so to speak, for its consumption, but definitely it's an interesting ritual that they go through every year, because since it's an excisable product, every year they take that still down. So the still is kind of dismantled every year, and then they at the start of the cashew season, when the first cashews appear in the tree is when they put the still back up. So the excise inspector comes around, and if he sees a cashew in the tree, he says, "Okay, you can put up your still."
That's right. I see. So to ensure that they're distilling the right thing, it's seasonal and everything.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
And when they start that process, they kind of put out some offering to the gods, and there's a god called the Devasar, which is the good god, and they put out a little bit of Feni, some cheap cigarettes called BDs, and a couple more things.
Cheap cigarettes, really.
And the next morning, they find the only thing consumed is the Feni. The Feni's gone. So the gods are happy.
The god of cheap cigarettes. I love it.
Yeah.
So obviously they're getting a bit of a facelift, these products.
Yeah.
Moving up in the world. Are there any of them exported yet?
Yes. So interestingly enough, I think a year or so ago, they shipped dried Mahua flowers to France.
All right.
And they fermented and distilled a brand called Ma in France. So that's a fear of mine that cultural appropriation may happen for some Indian native.
So that's FMIS, French made imported spirit.
Yeah. But apart from that, we do have some Feni brands which are being exported at a very small level, shall I say. I think the greater task for both Feni and Mahua is to build the category in India. And when I speak to people in importers, etc., Sukhinder Singh, for example, of the Whisky Exchange, he was over some time back. He was in our office and we were tasting some spirits with him, including Mahua. And he said it's more important to be able to build the category first in India, to get that popularity in India, before you can look at an export market.
Yeah.
Because anybody importing it into, say, the UK or the US will say, what's it like in India? What's the market size?
Yeah.
How are people consuming it? How is it being sold? So that's a bigger challenge.
And plenty of market opportunity in India as well, of course. There's a lot of people, right?
There is a lot of people. As we said, there's a certain amount of stigma which gets attached to it.
Yeah.
And the normal consumer, because everybody goes to Goa, right, of a certain income and class, Goa is typically a holiday destination of choice. But their exposure to Feni has typically been the mass market Fenis, which, as I said, are not necessarily the most palatable.
Are there any other spirits that we should talk about that's beyond Mahua and Feni?
Well, in Feni, coconut Feni is quite interesting because you've got coconut Feni has about 19 different varieties, and each variety it's like a single botanical gin. So you've got ginger Feni with coconut Feni as the base.
Okay, so a spice or a herb is put in as a botanical.
Absolutely. So it's kind of infused in the neck of the still in a small sack to get the flavor into the gin, into the Feni. And typically that's linked to different ailments. So you used that particular ginger Feni to maybe clear your throat, if you had a cough. And I'm tasting one tomorrow. It's called the Dukshiri. It's made from the Indian sarsaparilla.
Oh yes.
So we have a root which grows called the Dukshiri, and that typically is meant to cure pain. So Duk in Hindi means pain. So you had the Dukshiri Feni if you had some kind of pain, maybe even heartbreak.
Maybe. That would be good, wouldn't it? Oh, well, that's fascinating and great for bartenders, I would think, because sort of single ingredient botanical spirits are really good for making cocktails.
Absolutely. I've tasted a coffee Feni, which could give Kahlua a run for its money easily. Yeah.
So sweetened as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So are all of these sweetened, or are they?
No. Just the coffee Feni.
Yeah. Okay. So like a liqueur kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And it just seems like you've got because India grows coffee as well, right? And obviously tea. It just seems like you've got so many ingredients at your disposal, and then, a very rich spirit producing or broad spirit producing culture as well. When you think about gin and whiskey and rum, and now Agave spirits, and obviously indigenous ones as well. It feels like you've kind of got it all going on.
Yeah, there's a lot going on.
So what are you excited about for the next 5 to 10 years, whether it be spirits or alcohol, maybe fermented drinks or bar culture in India?
I think, you know, from whatever everybody says, and we've seen this in our own company, in the drinks industry in India, we're kind of on the cusp of a massive growth phase. IWSR indicates that 2028 will add $7 billion in revenue to $32 billion at the moment. So that's a big leap, a big jump. Every year we add about 20 million people to our legal drinking age of 21 and above. More than half the population is above that legal drinking age. So just from a sheer demographic perspective, apart from what we're seeing from an economy and that upswing perspective, the roots and the foundations are all there. So I sense that we're at an extremely exciting time in India from all parts of the ecosystem. Spirits, beer, craft beer, the drinks industry, indigenous spirits, entrepreneurship, the bar industry. It's all kind of, it's like a perfect storm.
Perfect storm, and you are one of the big waves in that storm, I think. Like 25 years of doing this and witnessing what you've seen and the growth, and wow, it's great to chat with you and hear about it all and to learn about these spirits.
Pleasure.
And to see what's coming next. Vikram Achanta, thank you.
Thank you, Tristan.
Where can we find you? Where are you? Rum Doodle?
Rum Doodle 69.
Great Instagram handle. Solid. Rum Doodle 69 on Instagram, and India's 30 best bars and various bar shows around the world.
Thank you so much, Tristan. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.